This is the Wait Just an Infosec podcast, your weekly opportunity to tap into the minds of some of the world's foremost cybersecurity experts. Wait Just an Infosec is a weekly show live streamed on SANS Institute social media channels on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The show features a wide range of guests from across the InfoSec community. Whether we're diving into the weeds of the latest data breach or exploring the security implications of groundbreaking technology such as generative AI, each episode brings you new insight to keep you engaged in the industry, feed your fire for knowledge, and amplify your value as an InfoSec practitioner. Join the SANS community and gain free access to cutting-edge industry news, cybersecurity resources like technical research, and tools that can't be found elsewhere. Subscribe for free today at sans.org/join.
This episode of Wait Just an Infosec features a conversation between guest host and ransomware subject matter expert Ryan Chapman and cloud DFIR expert Megan Roddie, who have a lively discussion aimed at helping our community with actionable tactics to combat ransomware attacks in cloud environments. Enjoy.
So we have Megan Roddie, co-author of SANS Forensics 509. Megan, you also have a book in progress. You're coming close to
Yeah. Actually, it's perfect timing because today our publisher, we approved the final copies and it's going off to all the stuff they do on their side. So I'm done, which is what's important to me. So it's up for pre-order on Amazon. It'll be released through Packet Pub if you have a Packet Pub subscription or want to buy direct. And I believe the Amazon pre-orders will be delivered on August 10th. So less than 2 months out, getting close. It's on practical detection engineering. So a bit of a different topic, but I like to spread my knowledge into different topic areas.
Awesome. Well, speaking of topic areas, when it comes to ransomware and it comes to the overlap with cloud, you and I have been communicating now for a good year now, trying to find a good spot where we have enough overlap, and we've now found it. We've now found it.
Yeah, sometimes the topic comes and you find the person to collab with, and sometimes you find the person and got to come up with the topic. So that's where we went this time. We knew we wanted to do something together, and how do you combine cloud and ransomware?
Yes, and we're doing that, and we're kind of sandwiching in, if you will, a mini episode of our Stay Ahead of Ransomware series. This is technically episode 3. My co-host, Mary DeGrazia, is slightly busy right now. One of the more important things that we do here at SANS is teach classes. So she's doing that right now. So I figured, all right, I guess. So Mary is out, but Megan is with me, and we're going to get into this. Now, first up, if we can get the Slido back on the screen and see what our watchers have provided and submitted. Oh, boom. So I would say many of these apply directly to just threats in the cloud. Like, look at the first one right there in our word cloud. Speaking of cloud, people. Megan, how often is it that you find organizations that cannot protect the cloud well enough because of a lack of people?
So I actually think that while some of it's people, a lot of the people aspect comes to endpoints. They're clicking on links, they're downloading, like that's what you're seeing, attachments and stuff for ransomware. I think the cloud, we actually see a different thing. A lot of the initial access, while it can come from like phishing links and things like that, we'll talk about how like files are less common. So a lot of what we see actually, I would say, is misconfigurations. People don't understand the cloud. We understand the concept of you install an AV, you teach users not to open email attachments that are shady, but we don't necessarily, depending on your organization, have the expertise of how do you secure the cloud. Cloud engineers typically care about the cloud functioning. The organization wants files to get from here to here, these people to have access, but they don't necessarily have security at the forefront. So I think users do play a role, and that's possible. But in terms of the people, I think it's more misconfigurations by the administrators when it comes to the cloud aspect.
Yeah, but the administrators are people.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
Actually, funny enough, I was interpreting people not necessarily to mean what I call a silly clicker, someone who click, but rather I was interpreting it as a lack of people to help protect the environment. But
and I would 100% agree with.
Right. I think, but when you answered, I'm like, oh yeah, people are also, we need more people to help protect it, but we need fewer people to do silly things or to not configure things extremely very well. Let's see, what else do we have here? A task tracking system just popped up toward the bottom left there. I mean, that's just huge in cybersecurity all around, right? Whether folks have some type of system like Jira or whatever it may be, and they're just using it horribly or not at all, or they just don't have a system. That's very, very common. We actually have at the very top there, security awareness, users clicking links.
Yeah, that's the one I was looking at first. When you said at the top, I was thinking that one, not the biggest word. Yeah, now I see. Yeah, a lot of on detection too. A couple on detection, which is interesting. And then some of it going to like hardware, which again, kind of like aligns with that detection thing. You can't stop it if you don't know how to stop it. Yeah. And then investment and money is always going to be a thing. How much does your organization value putting it back in there?
Look at the top right there. No playbook in our org. How common is that a thread between just ransomware response and just cloud response in general?
I think ransomware response, that's become more common to have a playbook because it has been a few years now that ransomware has been in the forefront of cybersecurity news. So I think IR teams that have playbooks in general know that that needs to be a playbook. I think the bigger challenge is that the cloud side is, again, just like cloud engineers don't necessarily have the knowledge and skills to secure the cloud, the incident responders don't have the knowledge to respond to incidents in the cloud. I mean, that's the whole reason 4509 was created, is that people didn't know. There wasn't a ton of training. There's not a ton of playbooks, and more are coming out. You have vendors like Azure and AWS actually releasing playbooks specific to the cloud. But I think it's kind of, again, merging those two concepts. You have your ransomware playbook, but how much of that actually applies to the cloud? Like you don't necessarily have an endpoint to isolate, things like that. You don't see the same type of lateral movement. So I think with what specifically looking at ransomware in the cloud, the issue is more of those playbooks being migrated to the cloud. But again, if you work with young IR teams, there is not a lot of standardization in how you respond.
In that regard, I know that many consulting firms, including very large firms, I work for a very large firm, you will typically have, some of them have hundreds of consultants, right?
Yep.
And yet, meanwhile, of those hundreds of consultants, how many of them could take, quote unquote, any, again, my favorite little any case that's cloud-based and do a proper response and analysis? That number is not as high as you might think.
Oh, yes. Definitely not. Yeah. So like I work at IBM, I work at X-Force. And so I don't work on X-Force IR, but they are a consulting IR team. And I see the exact same thing. It's like, and I actually tell people coming up in cybersecurity, get cloud certs, even just like an AWS security analyst, because those are the people I see rise and start getting poached by other companies, the one who are considered the cloud IR SMEs. That's who I always hear about in our org, the ones who there's a cloud incident, it goes to them. It's not just, okay, who's next in the cycle? Is no, this is Azure. We just have those 3 guys who really know how to work with Azure, bring them in. And those are the people I see leave the org quickest because those skills are attractive to new employers.
Gotcha. Yeah, I recall my first very large GCP case. I remember I was Googling and I was like, "What's a sync?"
Yeah. The terminology alone
I gotta learn
requires so much studying. That's like at 4509 as a course, that's what a lot of students say is like, oh my God, we're going from AWS to Azure to GCP to GWS to 365, and all of them handle things differently, and it's insane. So that's a skill set that's very rare to find, especially from a consulting perspective. It's even harder because if I'm in an org and I'm working for an internal team, I know we have Azure, I know we have AWS. When I'm working for a consulting role, I have to work with what the customer has. I don't get to choose whether they use Azure to AWS or even Huawei or Alibaba. Like you could start getting really niche, and the materials out there on the internet and how to do this response vary. Like Microsoft and Amazon, they publish a lot of guides, and try and help publish that information on how should you respond. But the smaller companies aren't going to do that. And so That really varies. I know the whole reason I got into cloud security and I was brought on as a co-author was I worked a Google Workspace incident, realized Google had no material at the time on like the IR perspective of Google Workspace. And so I started publishing content. I took that case, I learned, and I did blog posts, things like that. Eventually that material is found, and that's how I got in the course. So it is very hard without the background to approach those kinds of things.
That's fantastic. I just want to highlight, folks, rewind on the recording that will be available, what she just said, because a big part of how you excel in this industry is doing that very thing, finding a lack of something, especially when you need it. And rather than panicking, just be like, all right, well, we're gonna have to generate this. We're gonna have to develop it, and that's what it's all about. So
top secret tip, all the blog posts we see from like you, me, other SANS instructors, other professionals in the industry, they're typically just taking what they work on day to day, the material they already had, and creating it in blog post form. You don't have to add another huge time in your day diving in really deep into deep research. You're starting with something you already have experienced and understood.
Yeah. So speaking of understanding, let's set a foundation here, right? We're going to talk about some of these threats. In order to do so, I'm going to talk about vocabulary, right? So first and foremost, the term ransomware. I love doing this. I got to stop doing this. But ransomware is not truly understood throughout the world at this point. We used to use the term ransomware to specifically refer to a binary, what we call a portable executable, or a .exe file typically, right? Or maybe a .dll. It's something, malware, that executes and then does the encrypting, right? However, these days, when people say ransomware, typically they're referring to an entire attack campaign similar to the old school style that was first made, I would say popular or popularized in the general, would it be media? I don't know, just the general readership of cybersecurity, the cyber kill chain stuff, right? And so now we've evolved to the MITRE attack framework, and everyone is focused on, all right, well, where do these attacks begin? Well, reconnaissance, and then initial infection vector, and then tooling and execution, and then persistence, and then lateral movement. Like all those steps are carried out in a typical ransomware attack. And then towards the end of that attack, there's the old school term would be actions on objectives, which now per MITRE is impact. Right?
Yep.
What's the impact? Well, honestly, there's a data gathering which occurs before that, which is kind of where we have our overlap with the cloud-based environments. A lot of files and data shares being affected. So ransomware typically refers to the overall attack, not just the malware, the binary towards the very, very end of it. Right. Yeah. Meanwhile, you have a number of groups out there that are now just dropping the malware payload itself, and they're then conducting, what is that? What is that called? The general term that's kind of used now, de jure, de facto, whatever you want to call it, has been cyber extortion. The idea that the entire attack is carried out, the actions on objectives are getting your data out of the environment, exfiltrating your data, and then using that as what they're holding over your head, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So we have ransomware, we have cyber and or data extortions. People just call it data extortion. And that is really where we kind of have the overlap with the cloud. So you provided an example to me, and I'm going to make sure folks have this link. I think we may, okay, good. We got comments back from LinkedIn. Oh, good. I like to see what people are saying. So we've got, if you go to, let me pop it in the chat here so we can get it on the screen, FOR528.com/cloud-ransom. I just realized I shortened all of our links using my class shortener.
No problem.
You're like, oh, cool story, Ryan.
You can take the advertisement. That's all good.
I just realized that. Oh, how of me. I didn't even.
I don't even control that for my course, so I'll let you handle it. All right. Perfectly fine.
If folks go to this link, this is an article that when we were discussing, when are we going to have this overlap discussion and meeting that we're having now, this is what you threw my way. And I went, ooh, ransomware in the cloud. Yep. So do you want to give kind of a quick overview of the overall article /threat?
Yeah. So this actually has another connection to 4509. It was written by one of our instructors, Corsten Sam, who runs Invictus IR, started them. And he posted this, and the title you'll see is like ransomware in the cloud IR. And first question I said is, you call this ransomware? Like, there's no software. There's a guy making API calls. Maybe it was a script, but there's no software. And so that's where it came, where I was like, I would call that extortion. Like, I started looking up the definitions to get really technical of ransomware versus ransom versus extortion. And we can call it a ransom. They're holding something hostage. But basically what happened in this incident, it was an AWS account. Data was stored in S3. They got access to an API key, and they started querying all the S3 buckets. What S3 buckets do you have? Okay, what files are there? And then with that list of files and the permissions they had on the account they stole the credentials for, they were able to delete everything. And so they delete everything and they leave a note behind. This is very similar. We kind of saw an intermediary step, I feel like, because originally we had just ransomware and encryption. They encrypted the files, give them back to us, give us the money, you get the key. We started seeing a few years ago this movement to a double extortion campaign, it started being called, of we're going to encrypt your files, leave them there, so you need a key, but also we stole them and we're going to threaten to release them. So we'll post these on the internet. So that was the solution to people started getting, okay, we got better at cracking the encryption. Decryption keys were being shared more once they were cracked. So like that wasn't enough. Threat actors saw like, they just decrypted it and I didn't get my money. So they started stealing them. Yeah, you can decrypt it if you want, but we're also going to post it all on the internet. So we're seeing just kind of the latter half now, where they don't encrypt the data just because of kind of the challenges of doing that in the cloud, the permissions required, what that means. So now we see them stealing it, and the only way to get it back is by paying. So they leave this note behind, hey, yeah, your bucket's empty because we took it all, pay us. And so this is kind of the new era. I think this is what our ransomware campaigns in the cloud are going to be. They're going to be these extortion campaigns, because given the technology, that is the easiest method for threat actors to potentially make a profit. And again, we talk about moving to the cloud. Do people have the skills to understand what that means going into it? A lot of times it's a fully on-prem company and they're like, yeah, engineers, we're going to the cloud. They don't bring in specialists. It's just the staff have to learn. So where you're used to making potentially, and even this, a lot of organizations do, you may have a backup server online, but like on premise, but when you move to the cloud, do you remember the concept of backing up there? You can back up your stuff from the cloud, but if you don't create those backups, that's going to be an issue. You'd have to think about the financial impact of creating copies of all your data. And depending on the permissions they get, they're now in this single account. So if they get the overarching permissions, those backups might not matter. So I think we're going to definitely see this is going to be the trend, is this stealing the data, leaving a note behind. We'll give you your data back if you do it. So it'll be interesting to see if we see any other tactics, but based on kind of what is the smartest for the threat actor in terms of ease, I think this is probably going to be the approach they see as most feasible.
I very much agree on that. Some background: it was the Maze Group who became the Maze Cartel before turning into a Grigger, before a series of arrests that led to their downfall and the ending of their brand. Their affiliates went other places. The Maze team is who started the data extortion thing, or at least popularized it, if we can use that term. So it was back in 2019. I remember working my first Maze case, and it was all of a sudden like, oh, they did what? They have a data leak site. What? What do you mean? What are you talking about? They're showing all the data that they stole? Oh, goodness. You fast forward to very recently this year. If you go to, and I'm going to drop another link to my crew to drop to you, which is for528.com/BeyondLeon2. The spelling will appear on the screen shortly. If you go to that, there, almost. It's coming back. Here we go. If you go to Beyond Leon 2, you'll see an article from the folks over at Redacted. A good buddy of mine, Danny Quist, who might be on one of our episodes at some point, did a actually, hold on. He was on our last episode. I was like, I feel like he's associated with the show. Oh, yeah, he was just on. So he was on our episode 2 of Stay Ahead of Ransomware. if you go here, you'll see that basically they had an encryptor and it was faulty. They ended up making some mistakes and all the data was decryptable, just like you said. Their response, at least for now, in the past couple of months, was, you know what? Forget the encryption. Forget it. And we have a couple talks actually coming up, a very important one, especially at our upcoming Ransomware Summit, which is this Friday. And more on that coming up after our little episode here. And we're going to have a keynote from Mr. Alan Ransomware Sommelier Liska. Oh, I love that guy. And hi, if you're watching. And if you're not watching, why aren't you watching? And he's going to give a talk on the RAS, the Ransomware as a Service landscape that we have now, where groups were basically stealing. They were kind of being little vultures and stealing source code that was leaked, right? And then using that for their own purposes. Well, source code is hard to maintain, all the issues that you mentioned. And we're seeing other groups also who are just going, you know what? I'm just going to steal the data, right? In a typical ransomware scenario, we are now starting to see a lot more cyber extortion, if you will, right? Data extortion versus overall encryption. Another thing that's very important to mention here, actually, there's a couple things. In this article, I want to mention something very important. The second sentence under initial access. The first malicious activity happened outside of the 90-day retention period of CloudTrail. So just a heads up, especially for cloud-based threats, it's a lot of log analysis. So that level of log analysis requires, knowledge to analyze the logs. And what's the other thing? Oh, logs. You need logs. So it's very, very important that you set logging up within your cloud-based environments. And not only is it set up, but you're retaining it. So any general questions on log retention, or questions, things you want to cover about log retention and some of the various environments?
Yeah, so it's funny because actually when we run 4509, sometimes the eval are like, this is like a log analysis course, which is what we make clear on the course page. But it's like, yeah, that's incident response in IR. I actually, through RSA, which I don't know if that's published, but you can also find DFIR Summit 2022 keynote on the SANS YouTube, DFIR YouTube. Josh Lemon, co-author of the course, and I have a talk on this because we talk about being prepared for when that happens. So there is default logs, but typically a lot of the information you want is not going to be there and will not proactively appear if you just turn it on. So for example, very relevant here, there's this concept of control plane. So like management events, what's happening with accounts, what's being created and deleted. But then there's this concept of the data plane. So an S3 bucket was created, but what files are in there? And more specifically, what files were accessed? So you could create a detection for, let me know if, 300 files are deleted in 5 minutes, but those logs are not enabled by default. So you really need to be prepared and know what logs are going to be relevant in this case. Like I said, there's that talk. I have a couple blog posts on enabling and extracting logs. But yes, it's a big challenge. A lot of organizations, it goes back to this, do your engineers know how to configure the environment? Again, they want the environment to work. They don't really understand. They want the logs that will help them troubleshoot. They don't care who's accessing files, but we potentially do in an IR. So I think that's one of the key things I can say. If you want to be prepared for IR in the cloud, find out log analysis, like prepare your logs. Also, there's the time limit on logs. There's some ransomware threat actors who stay in an environment for an extended period of time. The default log retention is 30 days, 90 days, and the threat actor has been there for 6 months, which I've encountered myself. You lose a lot of context.
Yes, and very important to keep in mind that many ransomware campaigns begin with an initial infection vector related to initial access brokers, or IABs. If you go to FOR528.com/IAB, I threw that. Our backstage is like, what do you say? Here, I'll put that in. You can see basically kind of a graphic, if you will, an infographic of the landscape of the initial access brokers. The idea of initial access brokers is their entire thing is getting into an environment or to a slew of environments Once they're in the environments, they then will sell, lease, whatever, the access to basically the highest bidder, essentially. And many of those will be ransomware actors. Sometimes that access will be essentially sat on another one of these for forever, for weeks, months at a time. And if your logs don't have that initial infection vector, then you're missing a whole lot of the story, and that's no good. So here, I'm going to throw something random our way, because I didn't really think of it pre-show, but it's kind of important. What would we say are the top 3 important things to keep in mind in order to respond to a data extortion event in the cloud, right? Logging seems to be way up there, right? Logging is one of them. What are the other two?
So we're talking response, right? Not preparation.
Yes.
Okay. I think second would be understanding your environment. You don't want to, especially since the incident response team is usually typically separate from the engineering architecture team. You don't want to be like, oh, there's, they reach out, hey, everything in our S3 buckets got deleted. You don't have an account for response set up. You don't know where resources are. You don't understand how to use that cloud. So it is a bit more on the preparation side, but it's, in terms of the response side, it's being able to, when an incident occurs, being able to quickly identify what's in scope. So when you find out an account, like this specific John Doe account got compromised, are you able to find out which resources they had access to, what permissions they have? So I think number 2 would be an understanding of the environment. That's very, very important for the incident response perspective. And number 3, let's see if I can think of a 3 key takeaway. I think probably 3 is kind of similar to that understanding the environment, but having those playbooks in place. Again, half preparation, half response, but following those playbooks and knowing what you need to do at what stage, how you contain these incidents. Again, it's going to be very, very different from the perspective of the cloud than on-prem. You're not, if you're dealing with S3 buckets and compromised API keys are way different to deal with than a guy gave credentials in a phishing link or opened an email attachment that had ransomware. So I think number 1 is log analysis. Number 2 is understanding the environment. And number 3 is having those ransomware procedures.
And she gave a recap.
Yeah.
I love it. I was kind of on the spot.
It's partially for myself. I gotta recount. 3 is a lot of numbers to keep track of.
Yeah, right. You're like, what did we talk about? Okay, so a couple of things here in the last couple minutes. Let's talk about some defense and some preparation. So,
yep.
One of the things that you showed me was the AWS lock feature for S3 buckets. So you can go to for528.com/AWS-lock. It's right. Oh, look, it's right there. I got it. So if you go there, you'll see some information on setting up basically an object lock in S3. And this is something locking and also requiring like a PIN, if you will, is something that's very important. Many times where we do see cloud infrastructure affected by a ransomware attack, it is opportunistic from my perspective and the data research I've done, which is a lot for my class creation, right? And it's usually when there are credentials stored on a box, on a host, whatever you want to call it, and there's a command line tool for your respective logging or your respective cloud-based environment, like the G-Cloud tool, right? So G-Cloud init was already run, and the user only then has to then do whatever they need to do in order to, whether it's further skill keys, set up persistence. It's not really something that's really done a whole lot in a general ransomware campaign, but rather it might be that someone realizes, oh, look, this box is authenticated to a cloud-based environment. It has a CLI tool, and I'll go explore some of the data there and see if I can pull it out. However, most of the ransomware groups seemingly don't have that in their playbooks, because keep in mind, folks, we have our playbooks and they have theirs, right? So it's very important that we understand the more that they start gravitating to this cyber/data extortion in the cloud, the more it's going to make it into their playbooks. And the more we're going to start to see this over and over and over and over. Whereas now it's just more of kind of like a burgeoning thing, if you will. So we have the AWS lock. We also have, I have some tips for Azure. So if you go to for528.com/Azure, by the way, speaking of terminology, I noticed that I call it Azure and you call it Azure.
Azure.
Is that how it's properly pronounced? I would assume.
I don't know. That needs to be the next Slido poll. How do you say Azure? Azure.
Do we have time?
Azure.
Right.
Man, that's a good question. I'm teaching again coming up. My last co-teach. Maybe I've been saying it wrong this whole time. I need to be corrected. I'll coordinate with the cloud team and find out what the official phrasing is. I'm sure there's some Microsoft keynote you could watch to find out. I'll have to dive into that.
That's gotta be it. If you go to the Azure link, you'll see this is when I was doing my initial class preparation stuff, I put together a couple Ask an Instructor presentations for some large organizations. And there's things in here like how to set a PIN for critical operations. So there were some scripts that threat actors use will actually try to list out data, for example, from Azure backup. And if they do that, but yet yours are protected by a PIN, their scripts will fail because the PIN request pops up. What's the PIN? And the script's like, huh? The script is all of a sudden sentient, but huh? What are you talking about? So there's a number of things in here, also including using write once, read many, or worm, or as we now call it, immutable backup. So that's something also very important in the cloud. And Megan, something you showed me that's awesome for AWS, going back to AWS for a moment, is we have, if you go to, there's actually two of them technically. If you go to for528.com/AWS-blueprint, there's a fantastic document. Do you want to talk about the blueprint for a moment?
Yeah, so it was funny because we talked about doing this topic and that popped up like a few days later. I swear, every time I propose a topic, like someone blogs about it soon. So this came up. Amazon directly released it. They are pretty good about releasing different like playbooks and informational materials. So they released this blueprint for AWS ransomware, and it's follows the NIST framework and all the different aspects. So protect, identify, detect, respond. You're gonna see all those different aspects, and they map their controls, their specific security controls, and what setting you should use, what you should enable in order to meet the requirements of that NIST guideline. So whether it's protecting data, detecting incidents, responding to things. The one thing that kind of started a conversation with the cloud instructors was someone pulled out a list of every service mentioned in there, and it's like 20 different AWS services. And it was like, well, not everyone, there's no org that's willing to pay for all those services, figure out how to enable them, find an engineer that can do all that configuration. So I think the important thing to take away from that is not to turn it directly into a one-for-one checklist, but to understand what controls, like if you're already using S3 backups, check what they recommend for settings for that. Or you're already using IAM, what do they recommend? Or maybe you did get the budget for, you could add additional security controls to cloud. Okay, let's reference this document. What are some big wins, big preventable? So when you open this and you go, there's no way we're doing all this, do not attempt that. You need to go in and you need to selectively understand what is going to have the biggest impact. Return on investment, that's a business term everyone understands. If we're going to do this, the effort, the time, the money that we put in, which is going to give us the biggest impact in return.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So if you just add a 2 to the blueprint URL, it goes directly to the PDF, but make sure you read their write-up and they've made it for a reason. So check it out. All right, Megan, our time is coming to a close here on our little mini segment of Stay Ahead of Ransomware inside the Wait Just an Infosec episode for today. So what would you like folks to know about you? How can folks find you? What are some things you'd like to discuss?
Yeah. Twitter died, and so I'm not on there often. I'm honestly not great on social media. Connect with me on LinkedIn and Mastodon. I'm at Megan at infosec.exchange. I'm at Megan_Roddie on Twitter. I do post sometimes. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn with any questions. I know we didn't get time for questions, and there were a few. My book is on sale. It's called Practical Detection Engineering. You can find it on Amazon in the US for pre-order for August 10th. And come take 4509 if you want to learn some more. I'll be co-teaching at the DFIR Summit with Pierre Lidome. I'd love to see you there. If not, check out a future event.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It was really good having you on. We finally got together and got to do it. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for listening to the Wait Just an Infosec podcast. Remember to join us live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern for a new episode of Wait Just an Infosec. You can watch at SANS.org/WJAI or go to the SANS LinkedIn or YouTube channels. The Wait Just an Infosec podcast will be released every Wednesday at noon. Thanks for listening. See you next week.